Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event to assess the first 100 days of the new government. I feel a bit weird welcoming you to the Blavatnik School, as I'm not based here. I'm Anand Menon from King's College in London, and with me we have Professor Thomas Elston, whose work specialises on the organisation of public services. I'm not doing any of them credit by their introductions. You can look them up online. The names are up there behind them, should you wish to. Next we have Tom Simpson, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy and is our resident ethics guru for the evening, so no pressure at all, Tom. To his left we have Professor Linda Yu, who is a Professor of Economics at the London Business School and a Fellow here as well at the University of Oxford. Last but not least, we have Kieran Martin, who is a former senior civil servant and the founding chief exec of the National Cyber Security Centre, who is based here at the Blavatnik School. The way I'm planning to do this is I'm going to pose some questions to the panel. We'll have a little bit of a chat. If you have questions while we're going that are directly pertinent to what we're saying, stick your hand up. Don't know what you lot do because I can't see you, but we'll figure that out as we go. And then we will just take questions towards the end. But just as your starter for 10, I think, Linda, we picked on you to go first, but anyway. What have you made of the government's first 100 days in office?
I think you did say something about ladies first. I used to prefer that, and I'm not so sure tonight. I prefer that when it's to get into a queue for a food buffet, let me be very clear. Or a life raft, or... Okay, anyways. I would say on the economics front, if I use the analogy of an Oxford tutorial essay, I would say, pretty good outline, come back next week. It's all about how you fill in the outline. What is the argument when it's elaborated? What is the evidence? And what's the execution? And I sort of think that's what, in terms of economics, the first 100 days feels like. Literally on day one, they said, we're going to grow, grow, grow. And then we just heard the Chancellor, literally, Investment Summit today, and op-ed she wrote yesterday, was if growth is the problem, then investment is the solution. Okay, so that's the argument. So have they filled in enough of the details about how they will fund the public investment that's required to crowd in the private investment, and will they set out a growth strategy that more completely, I think, addresses what holds investment back in the private sector. So lots of economic surveys find that firms want less uncertainty, more skilled workers, and they also want, unsurprisingly, planning reform, so they can make investments in areas that, they may feel a bit unsure about, and then the cost of energy. So all of this goes into what could hold back private investment. So I would say first 100 days, we know that there'll be a national wealth fund, we know there'll be GB energy, we know that it's going to be about investment, we know there'll be a rejigging of the fiscal rules, but I think we're only beginning to see the contours of what that will actually mean, and probably the budget coming up later this month will flesh some of that out. So I think it's a good start. It was a very quick start, let me be very clear. Literally days after they came into government, they had already announced a review that set up the National Wealth Fund. So I think all of the intent is there, but I think, all of you will be thinking, as you would in any organization or in your job, that what's the difference between a strategy and a great strategy? It's the execution. So it's too soon to say. We made a joke about this earlier.
We might hear more of that. This is a panel, many of whom think 100 days is a silly metric by which to start judging a government. But anyway, that will, I'm sure, emerge as we go. Tom, do you want to go next?
Well, yeah, so I think there's, in a sense, you've made the key point there. You can distinguish between how the 100 days has gone politically and then how it's gone in terms of policy and execution. And on the latter, I think the short of it is it just is too early to say. And compounding that, obviously, we had a July election. Britain, for those of you who are new to Britain, there's always many who come in at the start of the academic year. That's great. Britain just shuts down in August. There's very little going on. And I think that's, government carries on, but there isn't the same energy and drive behind it. And certainly one of the policy areas that we may come back to, defence, this is absolutely true of what's happened in defence, which is one of the areas that I follow. The can has been kicked down the road on a couple of areas. On the political side, I don't think anyone would say it's gone very well at all. I think it's gone very badly. And I remember speaking with a friend about 2 weeks after the election, himself on the right of centre, and he was saying to me, I think Keir Starmer's doing really quite well right now. By about a month in, that optimism, even from those who may not have voted for Keir Starmer, had evaporated, and it's continued to evaporate over the course of the summer. So obviously the key features there, the riots had a surprising political price earlier on in the summer, and then the ethics scandals of the more recent weeks have taken a serious toll. And I think just the last point, I think what that's revealed is there was a reset moment, or not a reset moment, there was an opportunity for the incoming Labour government with a thumping majority to ride the crest of a perceived high level of popular support. But that thumping majority concealed actually relatively low levels of public support for the Labour government, about 33% vote share, which was lower, in fact, than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, I believe, and 2017 as well. So the distribution of votes for the Labour Party was very efficient in terms of translation into seats. And the Conservative Party were clearly voted out of office by the British electorate. And they were voted out of office because of integrity and competence scandals. And the integrity bit is now under question for the Labour Party.
So worth saying as well, I think, that one of the reasons why we're so in the dark, if you hadn't realised we're in the dark by now, is because this was an election about what you were not. It was an election about not being Conservative, which meant that actually you didn't have to define yourself so as much as maybe has been the case in other elections. Kieran, I'm going to let you go last as a recognition of the beauty of your trainers. That's your prize. So, Thomas.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. So, what's the news on public services then? I guess for a party that stood on a platform to fix public services and that wants to be seen as very pro public services and pro investment, again, the story is wait and see, right? I mean, I'm not at all saying they haven't been busy. I think a lot of work is going along in the background, but we've seen a lot of the problems and what the problems are, and we had the Darcy review of the health service, for example, that laid out very clearly what the problems are. What we haven't seen is how they're going to get fixed. The manifesto was fairly light from the Labour Party on fixing problems, less so with health, actually, and we could talk more than that. But it's been a summer of setting up task forces, getting the mission boards, which we're going to talk about, underway. But actual policy solutions to the big challenges that public services face, being very thin on the ground. We've seen some things. We've seen some crisis management, right? One of the first things the government had to do was deal with the impending crisis in prisons, right? So the early release scheme. We've seen the junior doctors' pay settlement, which was very eye-catching early on, possibly storing up problems for later. On the ethics front, we've seen the Hillsborough law, right? The duty of candour for public officials. Really important, but these are kind of all tinkering around the edges, really. So I think all eyes are on the budget again this week, a couple of weeks' time, and questions about public services for the budget. What is the balance going to be between investment and reform to try and drive productivity rather than extra investment? What is the balance between capital and day-to-day spending, right? Do you fix the hole in the roof? My son's school was shut the other week because there was a hole in the roof and the rain was coming in. What do you do about that? Or do you try and, really spend on revenue, on public services, day-to-day spending, more overtime and stuff to get the waiting lists down? So there's a big question there. And there's a big question in the budget as well about how much can you front-load the spending, right? Or do you need to wait for the economy to be doing better?
We'll come back to all of those, I suspect. Kieran, last but not least.
Well, I'll come to my footwear in a moment because it's here as a prop for my views on the 100 days. Firstly, like you and many of the others, I do feel it's a slightly sort of silly metric. So, apologies that we invited people here to consider their verdict on the first 100 days and then told you that it doesn't matter. But I think to some extent, there is something I think that's difficult for the government, for people of my generation, having just turned 50, and people thinking back to, say, the Labour landslide of 1997. Now, some of that is unfair because it's just the passage of time. There was a wonderful remark by the political editor of The Economist saying, this is no 1997. In 1997, I was 22 and I stayed up all night and, went on a massive sort of rampage. This time I was tucked up in bed 10 minutes after the exit poll. Sir Keir Starmer should take note. So there is an element of that. But and also there is, the sun was shining, the economy had been growing for years, and it's just not those times. Having said all that, having lived through that period, if you take education, a priority public service, by this stage, Blair, he'd done the sort of stick, he'd done his bit that upset people who use private schools. Those of you of our generation may remember the assisted places scheme, which they abolished. So it's a bit like VAT on private schools, a special sort of privilege which they abolished. But by this stage, they had set out a white paper saying, by this time next year, we will have passed an act of parliament to limit class sizes. So there was the much more direct and convincing explanation. There was a clear plan for constitutional reform, whether you liked it or not, and even though it didn't feature in the election campaign, it was quite clear, not least because I just left there, that Tony Blair was going to get really stuck into Northern Ireland. And so there was a level of activity and a narrative by then that I just don't think you have from this government. And so 100 days in, I was thinking about my own career change from, say, the civil service to here. I started in September, and by about Christmas, in other words, by about 100 days, I sort of thought, yeah, I can kind of figure out sort of a bit about how this place works. And it feels like they've been doing a bit like that, but I wasn't the national government in 2020, so perhaps. And so to my footwear, it feels, the reason I'm wearing these types of things is that for some stupid reason, I'm running the Abingdon Marathon on Sunday, so I'm wearing trainers as much as I possibly can. And if I turned up on Sunday and spent the first 5 minutes sort of making a bit of progress, but wandering around looking a bit lost, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but I'd probably feel a little bit, I should be a bit further on than this after 5% of the of the race, and they're 5% roughly into a parliamentary term. So it's not disastrous. I mean, every political commentator is saying that the scandals and the ethics and all the little stuff is hurting them because they don't have anything else to talk about, and I think that's broadly true. And there comes a point, 4 or 5% of the parliamentary term doesn't matter, but when it's 10%, 15%, when does it start to matter? So, and are the foundations there? I think you've heard, and this might be the thing to unpick, I think you've heard slightly differing views, and I'd be at the more caustic end of to what extent have they actually set out, to go back to the excellent very first contribution, to what extent have they actually set out the outline which is going to be filled in? I think that's to be debated.
But I have to say, if you set off the wrong way in your marathon, you're not going to win, are you?
No.
Might be an issue. But
Indeed.
Is it fair to say that where Blair had plans, Starmer has reviews? Because, my God, there are a lot of reviews going on at the moment.
There's a bit of that, but I mean, don't forget Blair's Chancellor was Brown, who was the king of the review, but it was also the review and also for some of the things like the health service. I mean, it was 3 years in before the big health service review came out and so forth. I mean, so it'll be interesting to see, and I think it's where it is too early to tell is. Whilst we now remember that period so well, and Gordon Brown in particular, as Chancellor, not as Prime Minister, was the master of the review that said exactly what you wanted it to say. Do Starmer's reviews, when they come in, say exactly what you want them to say? I think with Darcy, probably yes, and it was probably pre-cooked. But all the others, who knows?
Yeah. Just to say, for those watching online, you can put questions to the panel in the Q&A. You're just going to have to try and catch my eye, particularly the people behind us. But if there's something pressing as we're going, stick your hand up and we'll include you. But Linda, I'll come back to you because, I mean, this is one of the big questions, isn't it? Are you convinced that Labour have a plan for growth? They say growth an awful lot, but I don't think that works. But are you convinced that they've figured out how to achieve it?
Good question. So I was at a lunch the other day in the city, and someone was posing that same question to those of us who were at lunch. And the CEO next to me, he answered and he goes, yeah, because I think they're competent. And I turned around and said, wow, that is a low bar. Just to be competent, that's... and so, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, actually, I think that is actually right when it comes to the economics. So I think investment is the answer. So, quite a lot of economic studies all conclude roughly the same thing. The UK invests too little relative to comparable economies. One study found that compared to the G7, we have invested less than everyone else in the G7 for 24 out of the last 30 years. And so one of the challenges is growth is not, today actually the Nobel Prize in Economics was announced. So growth is hard. Growth depends on institutions, growth depends on lots of things, but the basic factors that go into the, I don't know why I'm thinking about food, but into the stew is, investment, people, some technology, and some good institutions. So I do think they're focused correctly on investment, but your question goes to part of what I think businesses are still wondering, which is this is not new news. There's more evidence behind it, but how do you translate the intent to get investment into actual investment into the areas that raise productivity, living standards, and then therefore growth? So I'll give you a few examples. So there's a lot of talk about capital. We all need better roads, we all need better rail, but we also need human capital. So one of the, I think, fallacies is somehow if you build great infrastructure, it's like Field of Dreams, they will come. Well, no, you also need skilled people. They're the ones who actually make the innovation. They're the ones who use the investment. So they talk a lot about green assets. Great. Green assets are not created equal. So what green assets? Are they the ones that will improve our standard of living? Digital assets. Digital transformation is all around us. So what digital assets? And I think it's only when you have that broad definition of capital and some clarity about what the sectors of businesses require to put the money in, then you have a chance of crowding in, because National Wealth Fund, for instance, will be funded by around 7 billion. We'll find out in a couple of weeks how. It needs to crowd in 3 times that investment. But that's a total pot of still, 30-some billion? That is a tiny amount relative to what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act, what the EU has done with the EU Green Deal, what China has done, the Made in 25 strategy. So if you really need that fund to generate growth, you're going to have positive spillovers as well. So there's quite a lot of steps there, but identifying the problem is the first step to finding a solution. And I just think we need, in the next couple of weeks, by the budget, to hear more about what those next steps are, and actually consult businesses and universities about investment, uncertainty, and skills.
Can I just ask you that, rephrase the question to you briefly in a more sort of viscerally political way? We all know that investment can lead to growth. There was a really good report by the Office for Budget Responsibility a couple of weeks ago in which they said, 0.5% of GDP investment can lead to 2.5% worth of growth. But, and this is the stinger if you're a politician, it takes 20 years. And if you're Keir Starmer, it's not enough that this will lead to growth. It needs to lead to growth before 5 years is up.
Yeah. Well, so interesting that so the Office of Budget Responsibility is the independent fiscal body. So they're the ones the government has to convince, in a sense, that their fiscal policies need to be scored in a certain way, generate this much growth, it will cost this much. So I think the stat I'll focus on is if public investment increases by 1% of GDP, 1% of national output, then in 5 years, that will raise growth by 0.5%. So that's within this parliament. So right now, growth is half of what it used to be before the 2008 banking crisis. We used to grow at 2%. Now we grow at 1%. So if in 5 years, 1% of public investment now can raise growth by 0.5%, that's pretty substantial. And that would mean that the government should focus even more on finding a way of borrowing to invest, and then separate that out from day-to-day spending. Because one of the reasons public investment is low is because it's all one big jumble. And therefore, if you need to meet fiscal rules like debt falling as a share of GDP on a rolling 5-year basis, which, by the way, means you'll never meet the fiscal rule because there's always a rolling 5-year basis, then in which case you do actually have a chance of delivering growth by borrowing 1% of GDP, if you can convince our creditors that within 5 years, that will generate higher growth. And this way, you also prevent capital spending from being cut, which is what we've seen over the past decade or so, because it's part of one account. So there's a difference between the current account, day-to-day spending, and then the capital spend. And I think there needs to be a pretty convincing growth strategy and implementation to convince bond markets, our creditors, to buy into that, because right now debt to GDP is about 100%. So imagine if you can grow the denominator, it's always debt to GDP. So GDP grows in the denominator, then you can stabilize the debt levels, even if the debt levels haven't come down. And so people have always focused on the numerator, but it's actually the denominator that really matters. Sorry, it's an impromptu math lesson. I should have said at the beginning, economists, economics has been defined as the science of telling you things you've known your whole life in a language you can't understand. So numerators, denominators, fractions, percentages. Back to you.
But it's worth getting it right, or you just become Liz Truss. So anyway,
Ellen, I'm not an economist and would love to learn more. So I take it there are two sources of investment. One is public investment by the government, where the bond market's going to be really important. And the other is private investment by corporations in their own research and development, technological processes, manufacturing processes. And I take it for that, it's tax policy is the key lever that's available for generating more private investment. Is that right? And if I'm wrong, obviously, do tell me. But if it is right, what's the prospect of investment-friendly tax changes by the Labour government? Because at the moment, all the messaging is about increased tax.
Yeah, so I was mentioning this earlier. I was checking the headlines from today's Global Investment Summit, and the Chancellor has committed to keeping corporation tax at 25% over the course of this Parliament over the next 5 years. So I think that is to show that the UK will have the lowest tax rate in the G7. But I would say the correlation between the corporate tax rate and investment is actually pretty weak. So a lot of business surveys, economic surveys, studies of businesses find it's uncertainty, it's skills, recently it's energy, and for the UK, it's planning, because between planning, higher energy costs in the UK, those two additional factors, which you don't necessarily find in other countries, are what makes firms sit back and go, I'm not too sure about this. And it's both domestic firms and international firms. So, so to me, the 5-year Parliament has the opportunity to set out clarity on how you're going to set regulations and policies. If you have a growth strategy, to crowd in private investment is what everybody wants to do, but they'll only come in if they think you're not going to change the metrics on them, because investment has some costs. It takes time for businesses to put in that money and receive returns themselves. But that's the best case scenario, crowding in. What you don't want to do is crowd out investment, which is the old model, that still worries people.
So I'll come back to you in a minute. There's a gentleman here's got I think you can just speak and your voice will magically. Oh, there's a mic as well.
Thank you. So running away from economics to something simpler, the riots. My question is for Tom. You mentioned, you brought up the riots as one of the challenges that came up. I'm interested in what you think regarding what the government or even the Prime Minister could have done differently, because it wasn't a pretty sight. I was still in Africa, ready to come to Oxford, and my mother had to ask me, "Are you still sure this is where you want to go?" So I'm interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Great question. So is it worth going over the facts of the riots?
The odd fact, there's no harm in that.
So there was a murder in Cardiff?
Southport.
Child,
3 children.
in the wake of which there's widespread misinformation on social media around the immigrant status of the alleged perpetrator, and which led to the spawning of riots off the back of that misinformation in a number of cities across the UK and the spread. So I'm a law and order conservative, so I believe in putting people, public order really matters, and we need to use the deterrent effect of the law for that. I think the political price, so the allegation that arose in the wake of it was so-called 2-tier policing. Some protests receive preferential treatment and very, if you like, soft touch, consent-based policing, and other forms of rioting don't receive that. And I think this actually touches in, so the question there is there a single standard being applied? So I actually don't want to get into that. I'm just saying that there was a political price being paid at that time by the Labour government as a result of those allegations. What I would say is I think the ethics challenges that the Labour Party have faced. I think part of the reason they're costly is that for the political left, politics is always a moral project. So it's always a morally driven endeavour. And elements of the right will articulate that as well at the same time. But it's often a more sort of pragmatic, sometimes overtly non-moral endeavour like that. And so there's always this question, is there some kind of hypocrisy that's being levelled at this point? So I think that's part of the context that was arising. But what I think it also led into was a sense that, is this a government that's actually in control of what's taking place in the country right now? And that was a key part of the cost.
On balance, they handled it pretty well, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I don't have. It's difficult to know what the counterfactuals are that are going to work out here. I think this is a structural feature actually of our politics now, that we are vulnerable to movements taking place on social media which probably erupt into public consciousness, kind of without visibility in the same sort of way. So I actually think this is going to be a challenge for states internationally.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think, the counterfactual was probably the loss of control of key streets. And I was a civil servant during the 2011 riots, where Sir Keir Starmer was then the director of public prosecutions. And I do remember in the sort of COBRA meetings, for those non-Brits, the emergency committee meetings in the first days of those riots, which had a much less clear-cut origin. There was an arrest and death in Tottenham, but the riots didn't start there, and nobody really understood why they were spreading and so forth. And I think I remember that fear that people were losing control of the streets, and that's where this sort of swift, round-the-clock, 24/7 opening of the courts idea came from. And the Prime Minister this time just took that playbook, and it seemed to work. So I think in that sort of fundamental case, I mean, it's obviously not what he might say, and lots of the Labour people, as Tom was indicating, it's not what they came into politics to do, but it is a fundamental duty of the state. I do then think there is a little bit, though, about the strategy afterwards. I mean, given my own field of specialism, I thought the focus, frankly, even though social media did play a role, but the focus on, allegations of foreign interference and, we're going to have a look at the tech companies, and then they went away from it, was all a bit weird. There's a lot more to this than just the tech companies, and I think the British political class as a whole was very lazy about blaming foreigners and American tech titans, and looking a little bit less closely at the homegrown aspect of this crisis. I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing was, for a few days, it was, we're going to be doing all this for the tech companies, and that's just all gone away. So even though I disagree with it, there was a bit of, sort of marching people up a hill and then just suddenly and quietly abandoning it. And I don't quite know why they did that. But on the core issue of that riot's handling, I think they did well.
I suspect their Oasis policy will go the same way on surge pricing as well. It was good to talk about it at the time, but actually doing something is a bit harder. Thomas, you mentioned the NHS. I think ultimately, if you want to go through a list of things that will determine the outcome of the next election, the NHS is either number one or number two. And you said that Labour have got some plans there. Are they convincing, do you think?
It's a great question, because if you read the Labour manifesto, one of the 5 missions that Labour stood on was to fix the NHS and deal with waiting times in a whole manner of different parts of that service. And there are some quite detailed ideas, 40,000 extra appointments a week, moving to AI, moving to more community-based medicine, more preventative medicine. So some quite sort of, for a manifesto, fairly, concrete ideas. And yet we're 100 days in and nothing, which of those ideas have survived the transition to government rather than the sort of policy platform is unclear. As you say, I mean, the Darcy report was, very detailed, done very quickly. It kind of looks like it was, that was sort of dreamed up a bit beforehand, but it's sort of facts-based. And the question now is, what can be afforded, right? What's the mix going to involve? So the sort of classic thing you would do is first a bit of deliverology, which I'll mention in a minute. Second, turning on the taps to use the private sector a bit more. Mm-hmm. And so some parts of the Labour Party would be very comfortable with that. Other parts would be absolutely not comfortable with that. I think the Prime Minister would be okay with it. So where's that going to land? And then this other thing I mentioned, so deliverology. So this is this idea that was used really in the last Labour government which did make significant progress on waiting times and NHS performance.
They also invented some stupid words.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure who invented that word, but yeah, so this is this idea that at the center of government, you have a few priorities. The Prime Minister sits on task forces that repeatedly go into those. You monitor progress, you put some investment behind it, and you measure the trajectory over time and hopefully get some improvement. And there are some quite robust research studies that said it worked. Right. The problem is, though, the context was totally different, as Kieran was saying. So the fiscal context was different. Yep. Did it work because of this top-down focus, or was it that combined with some extra resource? Also, there was optimism, right? There was a great deal of optimism with the arrival of Labour that things could change. And over this summer, you haven't seen a whole lot of optimism, right? Staff morale in the NHS is pretty terrible. I found out recently that sickness absence in the NHS remains higher than it was pre-COVID. That's very worrying. That's a big sap on productivity. So you can talk about sort of using AI and automatic diagnostics and stuff, but actually if you've got doctors and nurses that are off sick a lot, then that's a big problem. So, applying the old deliverology methodology of top-down focus on a few priorities, measuring progress, but in a very different context of not much resource injection and not much optimism. That's, is it going to work?
I mean, it's worth saying, I think when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, annualised growth was 4.7%, which sounds like a nirvana we're unlikely to reach again, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, Kieran, surely AI is the answer to this. Wes Streeting, our health secretary, seems really, really keen on technology as the answer to everything.
I'm hoping he's reading the excellent new book, AI Snake Oil, that has just been released, which I would commend to all policymakers by two Princeton computer scientists. Despite its provocative title, which is very dismissive, it's actually very, very good about its subhead is what AI can do, can't do, and is likely to be able to do. And its first example of the dangers of predictive AI is from healthcare. It's some American institution ages ago pioneered a predictive AI system. And when it first operated, I mean, obviously there were humans controlling it, so it didn't lead to the catastrophic outcomes that it would otherwise have had. Apparently, one of its defects was if you had patients presenting with pneumonia, you would determine whether or not they also suffered from asthma. Now, if you ask predictive AI to do this, they said, oh, people suffering from already with the asthmatic condition are much less likely to develop serious life-threatening conditions when they've got pneumonia, so we will discharge them. This is what AI was telling them to do. We will discharge them because they're much less likely. Why were they much less statistically likely? Because when asthmatics presented with pneumonia, the human being at the desk went, right, you're coming straight to the ICU. And so they had better health outcomes than people who didn't, but AI didn't know that. So AI said, oh, right, the asthmatics, send them home, even though they've got pneumonia. Now, obviously, you can improve this and so forth, but it is a real example of just the fact that and this isn't that long ago, Anna, we've got some way to go before this revolution can take place. The second thing, at the same time as the Tony Blair Institute report was coming out, there was a fantastic and enlightening report about IT in the NHS, which said that last year, 8,000 doctor years, 13 million staff hours were wasted waiting for computers to boot up, old-style computers to boot up. So there is, you've got whatever the NHS budget's going to be, you're going to have trade-offs between that, between fixing, booting up ancient IT, and we saw, some of the problems with cybersecurity in the NHS during the election campaign, really serious stuff. I mean, issuing an emergency appeal for blood donations after a cyber attack. There is a real trade-off between fixing the existing stock of IT and moving to the new stuff. So, no, look, of course, 10, 20-year horizon, whatever health service we have will be much more aggressively using AI, but it's way, way more complicated than a sort of panacea.
You basically say move beyond MS-DOS before you worry about AI.
I mean, there's certainly a bit of both, and there's a trade-off. There is a trade-off, and if you have a couple of cutting-edge bits of AI and you leave everything else untouched, I suspect the majority of the British population will not be overall very impressed with the state of the health service outside of a few specialist areas. It's about a balance, and I think we've yet, as per a lot of this discussion, we've yet to see where a lot of these macro and micro, not in the economic sense, just big and small trade-offs are going to be in their policy making, and that's an interesting one because both need to be done. I think the AI stuff as well, there is an issue, and it's an issue not so much for, we're talking quite politically at the moment, but there's a lot about state capacity here, and the state's capacity to understand what technology is and isn't capable of in the generation ahead, not just in healthcare, but in criminal justice and all sorts of public services, is really, really important. And that goes to the, if the Conservatives had improbably won the election, that issue would still have been there. And it is a big issue for the British civil service and public administration.
Okay, I'm going to come to the audience for questions in 1 sec. I'm going to take a question we've had online, so get your questions ready, and then the mic will come round. But we've had a question online from Sarah Cowley, which is a good Oxford name, who says, will Labour's Brexit-led red lines hinder economic growth? And why the hell is Starmer sticking to those red lines when the majority of his voters don't believe in them anyway? Anyone?
It's not for you.
I think it is for you, Anand.
Well, I mean, the simple answer, Sarah, is yes. There's 3 to 5% of growth locked up there, but the politics of getting there are A, difficult in the short term, and B, think about rejoining the single market, which is where that 4% is it's the sort of thing that is politically noxious because you become a rule taker with freedom of movement. And it's also the sort of thing our politics is incapable of, because it's a decision you'll take today, the fruits of which your successor but one will benefit from, which is not the kind of thing political leaders do. So yes, there is growth there. No, I don't think they're going to go anywhere near it.
The version of Juncker's curse.
Yeah.
Juncker's curse, named after Jean-Claude Juncker, the Eurogroup president during the Euro crisis. He said, politicians know how to solve the crisis. They just can't work out how to get reelected afterwards.
Yeah. And it's worth stressing that because incumbent governments don't do very well these days. So it's very, very hard to manage. Right. Anyone in the... We'll start with the gentleman there for the purpose of being near a mic. And then there's a gentleman, yeah.
Hi. Just going forward, I think, like all Labour governments, they'll have to reconcile all the tensions, for instance, between the activist wing of the Labour Party and the government itself. I mean, a very good example recently is to do with investment and growth. I mean, what we've had, the P&O crisis, and the investment summit that was just finished now. I read somewhere that Elon Musk wasn't invited because his politics are now not very nice for the rest of the Labour Party. So, I mean, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think the government have said he was invited or he wasn't not invited, I think is what they said. But I think he was watching his spaceship anyway, so.
By the way, it was a really impressive catch.
Yeah, really impressive. That was cool.
To catch a rocket in midair. It's, but I think, your point, I think the general point, and very much agree with what Kieran said earlier as well, there's inherently a lot of trade-offs. And the question for, on the economic side is it's very, because of the different constituencies the Labour Party has, just in like previously the Conservatives had their own constituencies, I think sometimes it's hard for them to admit the trade-offs, but as an electorate, we actually need to understand what the trade-offs they're making are. And I think it's that, in the age of social media, it's very hard to admit a trade-off, I think, without it getting maybe exaggerated. And so I think that's actually inhibiting how they're thinking about it. But I think all of us have probably had conversations with policymakers, very well-meaning in many cases, where they know there's a trade-off, but they just find it difficult to articulate exactly the choice they're making, sometimes because they're not sure. And sometimes, I still remember this from the campaign, when they did make an explicit trade-off, my first thought was, you just said you're raising taxes in order to fund X. You could actually raise taxes to fund Y. It raises a lot more questions about the trade-offs that they're actually making. Because, I've always thought, and there's a nice phrase, politics is the art of the possible. So politicians think everything is possible. At least they tell us. And then we find out later, maybe not so much.
It's worth saying, I mean, I don't know what you lot thought, but Keir Starmer's conference speech, it was quite nice. I mean, and nothing may come of this. I might have just been a complete fool to be taken in by it, but it was quite nice to hear a politician say, if you want cheap energy, you can have a pylon in your back garden. These are the kind of choices you have to make. And it's been a long time, it seems to me, in our politics since anyone has been that straight. I mean, we'll have to see. I mean, we'll have to see if he delivers. But it
That's a
was.
good example. I should have said at the beginning, Keir Starmer is an honorary fellow of St. Edmund Hall. He's actually our first prime minister. So I just want to declare, I actually have no bias, but I just thought I would declare that.
And we'll stop talking about it if the government's no good. Gentleman at the back there, then there's a lady here, the second in the blue top.
Do you mean me?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm right in saying that there's still no ambassador to the US and that there's still no ethics advisor.
We have an ambassador there now, but they haven't decided who's
Yeah,
replacing
that's what I meant, yeah. And of course, we've got the cabinet secretary, the whole question mark over the replacement for that. And there's other roles I can't remember that are not filled. And is that kind of symptomatic, or is it normally like that? I don't know what previous governments have been in this respect. It seems very laid back and like they haven't hit the ground running to me.
I mean, it's partly you, Kieran, because you were in government. But I just want to start with Tom on the ethics advisor thing. Is the kerfuffle over Taylor Swift and all that serious, or just noise?
So the puzzling thing about Taylor Swift freebies and the other and the relationship with Lord Ali and the wider Labour Party, the puzzling thing about it is the ministerial code's not been breached. There's no formal rule breach. What there is this kind of optics question. And I think it goes back to the point that I was just earlier trying to suggest that, so if you look at Rosie Duffield's resignation letter, the point that she really hammers on there is this is a government that seeks to promote the interests of the poorest in society, has just cut the winter fuel allowance, and now its leading members are taking freebies, quite expensive freebies in some cases, spending £20,000 on clothes and so forth. And I think it's that sense of hypocrisy which is what's done the damage here. So Keir Starmer's personal approval ratings are now lower than Rishi Sunak's were. And, that's quite staggering 100 days into a new government with this size of the majority compared to a prime minister who wasn't publicly elected, never sought a mandate from the country. And there was a sense of tiredness and exhaustion about the Conservative government at that time. And as we saw, public desire to remove the Conservative Party from government. So trying to locate where that sense of dis-ease, public dis-ease, has come from is a challenge. And I think Rosie Duffield's letter is probably the strongest indication that we have on that. So the question is whether this sticks. So just going back, my own view is that what it did for the Conservative Party was the integrity and competence questions, competence to Liz Truss, fiscal event so-called, and the Partygate affairs with Boris Johnson. And it was the combination of those that really led to the vote. And I think, the question for the Labour Party is can they sort of come out of this and then sort of re-establish themselves as a party of integrity?
Is it fair to say that the bar is lower for you if you've set yourself up as whiter than white? I mean, if you've stressed, the fact that you're going to stick to the ethics, that, you really believe in
these. Vulnerable, absolutely, yeah, right. Of course.
Okay, Kieran.
And sorry, just the other feature is we may be just living in a harder time to be a politician now. So, I've made mistakes in my life, but they've not been subject to the same degree of scrutiny that the Prime Minister's mistakes are. I dare say all of us in the room have as well. Politicians are living with a level of scrutiny that's never previously before existed. And so I guess one of the questions is, are we in a kind of transitional period where we're still capable of being outraged, even though we'll discover that actually most people in power, turns out, do make mistakes, ethics-related mistakes of some kind? Or will we readjust our expectations in the future? I don't know the answer.
So if the Prime Minister sticks a photograph of himself on Instagram from a Taylor Swift concert, it's not exactly intrusive to ask. Right, anyway, yep. Kieran.
A quick point on ethics and a quick point on the appointments question. I think on ethics, one of the puzzling things when the history of this period's written is the absence of, when they did get into trouble, the absence of a sort of narrative package around it. It was all very drip, and then it was, oh, we took these, and I'm not going to do this again, and I'm going to pay this bit back, and then we'll announce what the policy is later. Again, sorry, generational hazard. Going back to the way, what would Tony Blair have done? There'd have been some grandiose, and it would have been convincing in the first year, perhaps less convincing when we were doing it for the 5th time in year 10 of the 10-year premiership. There would have been, the ethics advisor dates from, partly that period. You'd have some sort of package of, like, this is how we're going to work in terms of, appointments, honours, funding, donations, and there would have been a policy here. There just wasn't. There was no sort of, and there would have been a new ethics advisor appointed. So there would have been, there would have been a package of announcements to place it in that would have given people something to look at, to debate, to show a certain seriousness and to show a bit of proactivity. So it's puzzling that there hasn't been that. On the appointments, I'd be a bit more relaxed about that. I mean, there's a fundamental difference in the British system, not just from the US system, which is profoundly different after the government changes, where, I think back to 2009, where a previous cabinet secretary, Gus O'Donnell, got into a modest amount of trouble for complaining in public that during the aftermath of the great financial crisis in the first 6 months of President Obama's term, there was nobody to talk to. I mean, famously, at one point, the US Treasury Secretary answered his own phone, etc., because so it's not the US, but even Westminster systems like Australia have much more churn. And if you take, for example, Washington, I mean, Dame Karen Pierce, who's in Washington, is a ferociously good diplomat, and she's already got the Prime Minister, a call with with former President Trump when he got assassinated. When the assassination attempt happened, they've had one-to-one. Sorry, Freudian slip. Bit of disinformation there. There's been a one-to-one.
Shows how to change the video after.
Exactly, but she's so I don't think that matters at all, to be honest, in terms of Washington. I do think things like it took quite a while to get a head civil servant in number 10, don't really understand. It's a bit leisurely, that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of that, but it's not as damaging as it would be in the American system. But again, I think it still shows this sort of slightly strange lack of paciness in some of its decision-taking and sense of purpose.
Does it concern you? I mean, we've got a foreign office, okay, with loads of diplomats in it. Does it concern you that the government seems to be thinking in terms of a political appointee?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, once or twice everybody does it. I mean, and also, if you think it's been so rare. So it happened in the 70s, famously, with the recently deceased Peter Jay under a Labour government. It happened in South Africa under the 97 to 2010 government with Paul Boateng. The Conservatives under David Cameron did it with Ed Llewellyn to both Paris and Rome. And interestingly, he's still in Rome. The Labour Prime Minister seems perfectly happy with them. So, it sort of depends. I mean, look, it's the UK. There's the odd kink in the constitution here and there. If there was a systematic overhaul, then you'd want to debate that. If it's the odd appointment here and there, even if it's Washington, I suspect the world, the sun will still rise tomorrow. The UK-US relationship will still be broadly fine. I mean, put it this way. The outcome of the election in November is a lot more important to the UK-US relationship than whether or not Sir Keir Starmer appoints a politician or a civil servant to the role.
Can I just say, for Americans looking at the UK, they were absolutely astounded that on July the 4th, Labour government won. And literally within a day, you had the Prime Minister and he named the entire cabinet. I mean, the US is like, you have an election in November and you hope to have somebody in place in January, otherwise Timothy Geithner's answering his own phone. Yes. I mean, so it's just different, isn't it? So American
fair,
friends
I think half our new government were astounded as well, which is probably the problem. Thomas.
Well, it's just a footnote to this point, just to give you some numbers. So in the US, when you have a transition, it's in the region of 5,000 appointees will change. So depending on how you count it, but it's a big number in the 5,000 roughly. In the UK, we're talking maybe 200 or 300, right? Ministers and SPADs. So I'm not worried. But what you probably will see now is senior civil servants feel I'll stay in post to see the transition and then we'll move on. And arguably that's kind of what Simon Case has done. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bit of that. But to answer your question directly, no, it doesn't concern me given other ways. And, Donald Trump, some appointments were never filled out of that 5,000 for the whole time.
Lady.
Can I go back to the comparisons that Kieran keeps making between Tony Blair and Keir Starmer? And I should kind of declare that I was first elected to Parliament in 1997 as part of the Blair input.
You were Blair babe.
Indeed, that is an incredibly insulting, obviously, description that was used by journalists to try and make the women feel small and as sex objects. But frankly, since I was elected age 50, I quite enjoyed it. And some of my colleagues got lots of nice clothes and model shoots out of it. To return to the serious issue, I think what you can definitely say about Tony Blair is he's a much better politician than Keir Starmer is. And I want to contrast the snappy pledges, which the 5 pledges, which all people elected in 1997 have engraved on their heart, of which one was reducing class sizes to below 30. And that was a very important pledge. It was extremely popular, obviously, with people, and it was, bluntly, relatively easy to achieve. You just needed to recruit more teachers. And it didn't actually solve all the problems that there were in education, but it was emblematic. It was a snappy slogan. Everybody was quoting it back at you before the election, and you could deliver it. But it didn't solve the problem. Whereas Keir's taken a different approach, which probably reflects the fact that he's fairly new to politics, but is terribly good at management, which Tony Blair definitely wasn't. And that is these missions. And actually, I think they're a very sensible approach. They mirror what I had a long career in local government as an elected politician beforehand, and Professor John Stewart in Birmingham coined the idea of wicked issues, which is basically issues which are very, very complicated, which require you to do an awful lot of different things in lots of different places to actually achieve change. And I think that Keir's missions are actually like really trying to address those wicked issues and to say, I can't actually solve, I can't improve the NHS or the education service tomorrow. I can't get growth going at the level that actually deals with the other problems we've got that quickly. It's going to take me at least 5 years. And this is where I'm trying to go. And I will be filling in the blanks as we go along. It's not that I, Keir, don't know how we're going to get there roughly. But, it's not something I want to get out there now because I'd like to have to read a whole book or list to you about what he wanted to do in each of these. So I guess I'm saying that I think you're right. You can't judge at 100 days, this government in particular, whether it's achieved what it said it would, because all of the things it's achieved are much, much more long term.
Thomas, missions.
Missions. I mean, I very much agree, actually. So the 100 days thing, there's a track record of implementing big changes to public services in the UK that cost a lot of money and don't get you very far. So for example, the Lansley reforms, right? Not only cost a lot of money, distracted a lot of people, but actually, fundamentally hampered our ability to deal with issues like COVID. And if you read the Darcy report, it says that the legacy of that problem and the sort of reduction in management capacity is still there and still causing a problem. So I'm not too concerned that we haven't got big plans in place yet. I think they're working on it. It's just some of it is quite urgent, I suppose. It's urgent. We need to fix the roof, like I said. It would be John Stewart, yeah, great academic. I think the wicked issue thing, you raise local government. A lot of these wicked issues are at the level of local government, and yet capacity in local government has been eroded massively over the last 14 years, right? I think if you look at a graph of where the money was and where the cuts were, it was by far the largest in local government. Now, Labour traditionally well disposed towards local governments. There's a big question there of what are they going to do, right? So if we go back to the NHS productivity thing, staffing in hospitals has gone up quite significantly since the pandemic. I think it's something like 17%, and yet productivity has gone down. So this is a big problem. Can you solve productivity in the NHS on its own, or do you need to look at the intersection between the NHS and local government and adult social care? And I think that's your wicked issue, right? And I think that's absolutely there. But is local government in a position at the moment with the funding settlements it's had, and where 40% of your budget is going on social care and it's not being refunded from central government? So, it's the wicked issue thing encourages you to look at the whole scope of a problem, not just the silo in which it exists. And I think that's absolutely right. But that means devolving significant money outside of Whitehall.
Right, I don't know how serious Blavatnik are about finishing on time. We've got a gentleman at the back there. Then we're going to take your questions, sir. Then we've got a lady right at the back there. We're going to take all three and we're going to answer them, and hopefully done by 7. No pressure, but can the questions be very short, please?
Of course, though already addressed by the panel, I'd like to return everyone's focus to the riot question that was asked earlier. I've come from the Republic of Ireland and we've seen similar riots recently, and it seems like the consensus on the panel was that the government dealt with the riots well. But the underlying conditions that led to the riots, do they feel the Labour government in their first 100 days have done enough to deal with them? It seems like a major existential political issue that the broader West is facing. So how do you feel Labour fare in terms of tackling this issue?
Well, thank you. Lady at the back. And then just this gentleman here to round us off.
I wanted to ask about the two-child benefit cap and how you think the government has dealt with it, whether they shouldn't have passed it, or shouldn't have proposed it now, or whether it should be a policy at all.
Okay, do you want to start, and then we'll come back to you, sir? Do you want to start on the first question about the riots? Who wants to take? I mean, I can say something if you don't want to. I mean, what I would say is, I mean, there's several things. Firstly, by every available indicator, anti-immigrant sentiment and racist sentiment in this country have come down steeply in the last couple of decades. I mean, if you take survey evidence, focus group evidence, so there's that. On the other hand, what is equally clear is over the last 3 years, the salience of those issues have risen. And that is linked to some of the rhetoric we've heard from politicians, from commentators, the focus on the small votes, the rhetoric about these people coming here and, you know, taking our houses, whatever it might be. I think one of the reasons we had that flashpoint is because this issue became so salient. Plus, and I think this is absolutely fundamental, you don't tend to get things like this unless people are suffering economically. And, you know, we've had 15 years in this country where median incomes have grown 1%. We've had very little growth. We had the cost of living crisis. We had COVID. So I don't see this as a general issue. I see it as a confluence of a lot of things at the time, though I wouldn't lose from sight the big picture fact that actually in terms of attitude towards other races, this country is a damn sight more liberal, probably than it was 10 years ago, certainly than it was 30 years ago. So there is progress, but actually I think you had a confluence of issues around the rights itself. Will that do as an answer? Right. Two-child. Do you want me to do this as well?
Oh, I mean, very quickly, I think, again, to slightly duck the substance of the issue, there is, unlike, say, the winter fuel payment, you know, whatever they're going to say, I think, say it around a narrative in a budget. There's a bit of me, regardless of one's views on the actual policy, and, you know, savings had to be made somewhere. You know, this was booby-trap policy making by the George Osborne chancellorship. And I really dislike booby-trap policy making. You know, get something that doesn't save a great deal of money, but just do it because it's absolute classic dividing line. And this is why I'm not a politician, but sometimes I just love somebody to just say, look, this was a completely stupid policy designed only to just, you know, create a political dividing line. So in the context of doing much bigger things, I'm going to get rid of it, whether that's two-child or something else, but we do this all the time. So I don't...
On two-child in particular, it is a public policy where there is incontrovertible evidence from loads of different studies that A, it doesn't serve to reduce the number of children. There is no effect on the number of children. And B, what it absolutely does do is drive more children into poverty. Yeah. And it does seem to be on the back of that evidence that keeping that policy in place is a bit egregious. I mean,
but it polls
yes, it will cost money.
But changing it polls badly.
Yeah.
We know that.
Changing it polls badly with the British people. We'll see what happens in the budget. Finally, sorry, you've been waiting for ages.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments so far. Julian Darley, leaving aside the ecological question of whether growth is a good thing, you've talked about fiscal measures, but you've been hinting at that actually at the front lines there's a different kind of problem and that people are being blocked from doing things. And I give you the example, I'm working with a senior NHS surgeon on an AI-powered app, health, climate, food app, and I get to talk to him a lot and some of his surgeon colleagues. They talk about how to get the waiting times down all the time. I'm wondering, as using this as a measure as well, how much can this government do to actually talk to people at the front lines who know by and large a hell of a lot more and talk about this stuff all the time than people who might be policy wonks and other kinds of rubrics, right?
Kieran and Thomas, I think, or one or both.
Well, given that I think we're finishing soon, to inject some optimism, I think the former parliamentarians comment that the Prime Minister is somebody who actually pays quite a lot of attention to management issues, who has led a significant public authority, and does seem, you know, every Prime Minister I've come across comes in saying, I'm going to delegate and let people get on with it, and none of them ever do. This one apparently seems reasonably serious about so doing. In fact, maybe the source of some of his political short-term political challenges. So yeah, it's a great call, and I think it's a hard thing to do. You know, I mean, one of the things that I think, you know, one of the really boring bits that I think the PM and others would do well to pay attention to is just the wiring stuff. I mean, mission boards sound very much like cabinet committees to me, just with a fancier, more 21st century name. That's not going to cut it. You're going to have to think about why people are so departmentally focused. How are you going to talk to the right people in the frontline public services? Because there'll be some bad ideas as well as good ones. It's really quite difficult, but I think they're probably quite serious about it, and they have a majority to do it. I wish they were a little bit further on, if I'm honest.
I think it's a great question. So I'm optimistic as well. So I think if I was to write a list of the sort of fundamental barriers to innovation, it would be risk aversion, because everyone expects you to get it right, and if you get it wrong, it's in the Daily Mail for a long time, right? So there's kind of the risk aversion of that, an unforgiving parliament, an unforgiving public, unforgiving media. And there's another barrier to innovation would be capacity, technical capacity and fiscal capacity. And I think there's no slack at the moment, and you need slack to experiment. I wouldn't put on the list, can you listen to frontline, or should you listen to frontline? I'd even say the director of public prosecutions was in many ways a frontline job. I mean, in charge of a large organization, but they're prosecuting the worst cases, in the criminal justice system for 5 years. So I draw comfort from that. And also, as we were talking about before, that we haven't seen kind of knee-jerk reactions of, here's what I'm going to do in the first 100 days to get it going. So I am optimistic. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed to happen. But I think, can you do it? Yes. Is it a fundamental barrier to innovation? No. Whereas there are some other things.
Did you bring another question?
No.
We're just out of time.
We're out of time.
No, I was just going to say, I think 2 quick points on this. First 100 days, the reason why the American presidents do this is because that's your most popular. You need to set out your stall. I think we have seen quite a bit of that in the government. And so actually, I think it's a reasonably optimistic debate. But I wanted to come back to this point about change. So you can do who's gotten a passport recently in the UK renewed? It was a 10-year project, and now you can do it online within minutes. So sometimes if you listen to the frontline, to the customer, actually you can see government do incredible changes. I mean, you used to have to go and queue up in Croydon for days, weeks, and now you can do it in hours. That's technological change. That's not AI, only a little bit, but I think things can improve. So I just wanted to inject a note of optimism, because we're all in danger of letting everybody go to the pub right now and go, oh my God.
Okay, well, you're all more optimistic than me. That's great. I have to say, given that half the panel didn't believe this was a question worth talking about, I think that went rather well. So could you show your appreciation to our speakers, please? Obviously, look out on the Blavatnik website for future events here. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening.